Hello everyone, I'm really thrilled to be here to talk to you about my favorite subject, which is drugs. The previous speaker opened with a joke and I wasn't going to either, but now that he did, I have to. So a horse walks into a bar and the bartender says, "Why the long face?" Okay, I know, a lame joke. Alrighty.
Where's the drum?
Ba-dum-bum. So what we're going to talk to you about today is drug forecasting. You know, what is the future going to hold with respect to your drug plans? Most of you have probably had a pretty flat trend in the last couple of years, and you're thinking, whoa, you know, I can relax. Drugs are trending low. I can focus on other areas, and I don't have to worry about drugs. But what's the future really going to hold for your drug plan? And that's what I want to talk to you about today. We'll look at the past, because the past is a good predictor of the future. We'll investigate some of the drivers that lead to drug cost increases. And I want to talk about some of the ones you maybe haven't heard of before. We all know that the aging population, more chronic conditions, those things lead to cost increases. But there's some other drivers as well, and we'll talk about those and hopefully be able to provide an outlook for the future on where your drug spending is going to go. The first point I want to make is that your drug plan is vitally important to your employees. When we look at Canadians and their drug coverage, roughly 72% of Canadians, and most of them are working, don't have coverage through a government to pay for their drugs. They rely on their employer. And drugs are necessary to sustain life in many, many cases. So your drug plan is incredibly important to your employees. If they didn't have your drug plan, there really wouldn't necessarily be a government option for them to go to, or certainly not an easy one. In Ontario, there is Trillium, but it is a very difficult program to navigate through. So your drug plan is important. We spend a lot of money on drugs in Canada. Over $22 billion was spent last year on prescription drugs. 574 million prescriptions were filled in Canada. One of the interesting things on this chart is the fact that 66% of all those prescriptions were filled with a generic drug. Well over half, which is great. I mean, if that tells me one thing, 66% of 574 million is hundreds of millions of prescriptions filled with a generic drug. I think they're safe and effective. We don't hear on the news that these generics don't work, that they're not effective, although there was in the news just a couple of weeks ago some bad scandal around one drug company and closing a plant of manufacturing in India, and it was a generic drug company. But really, for the most part, we have years and years and years of hundreds of millions of prescriptions being filled, and we know that generic drugs are very safe and very effective. And they come at a very low cost compared to brands. 66% of prescriptions only represents 23% of the money that we spend. So there are a lot of claims, but they're inexpensive claims, so they don't represent the majority of the cost under that spending. Where have we been over the last 20 or 30 years with respect to drug spending? This really is just showing the percentage increase in the cost of how much Canadians spent on drugs every year between 1979 and 2012. And there's a few key things to note here. First of all, never in history have we had a negative trend until the last couple of years. Never before have we seen it go down. And it went down. And that's a great thing for you as plan sponsors in the room. You've probably seen a similar pattern with your own drug plan. And even prior to the last couple of years, it's really been a slowing trend. But what does this chart really show you is that things go up and things go down. And I think the best predictor of future behavior is the past behavior. Are the low trends going to stay? Probably not. If we look historically, things go up and things go down. And this is particularly an unusual phenomena. And we'll talk about why we've had this negative trend. By the way, I did just get the numbers for 2013. And it's plus 0.02, so it's almost as well another flat. Yes? Oh, and by the way, feel free to ask questions throughout.
Yeah, just one thing caught my attention on the slide. 2013, 574 million prescriptions in Canada.
In Canada.
So that's 20 a person.
Yes, that's you know what? Good math.
Everybody takes them, like kids and most kids anyway. So that means probably 30 for the users. That's a pretty high number.
That's very high. And that's partly because we go to the pharmacy once a month instead of 4 times a year. We don't always get a 90-day supply. If we could really change that number if we had everybody filling their maintenance drugs.
So if somebody goes monthly, Barb, just to kind of jump in here, that means that there are 12 prescriptions for that one person for that one.
For that one disease. So your cholesterol is 12 prescriptions. But had you gone 4 times a year, it would have been 4 prescriptions. But pharmacies are good at getting us in every month. You know, it's fun to go to the pharmacy. It's like a mini Sephora in some of them for the ladies. The men, they've got gadgets and magazines. I mean, it's fun to go hang out there, and they know that. So this slide really sets the stage. Where's the future going to go? And I think it will be somewhat like the past. Now, what does a drug plan really cost? And it varies by province and by region. But ultimately, if we were to look at Ontario, the average cost per eligible cardholder under a drug plan is $1,078. That's what it costs to deliver a drug plan. Here to your number, 14.8 prescriptions per person in Ontario is the average, is the normal. And you know, go down to Western Canada, it's down to 11. You go into Quebec and it's even much higher, over 20 in Quebec. And that's really prescribing habits a little bit. Quebec is particularly unique because the provincial health deductible is a monthly deductible, and so pharmacists just always dispense everything monthly there. But for people under the age of 65, about $1,000 a year is what you can expect to have your drug plan cost. Now, there are factors that drive costs, and some of the factors drive costs up and some drive them down. So I want to talk about both of those, and we'll start with what's driving costs down.
Sorry, Barb, can I just ask a question?
Yes.
Back to the last slide.
Yes.
The average of about $1,000 a person. When you're talking per person, are we including their family members as well? Is there $1,000, or let's say somebody has a spouse?
That is a fabulous question, and I should have made that clear. You're right, it is one employee, and that one employee might be 3 people or 5 people or a single. So you're right, that could include more than one person. And that's why it might seem a little high. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. That was great. So on the downward pressure, we have had 2 things really happen that have driven to these negative results in the last couple of years. First of all, the patent cliff. The patent cliff is a phenomenon that has just recently happened, where we had a large number of drugs lose their patent, and these were blockbuster drugs. Drugs like Lipitor for cholesterol, the #1 drug in Canada with sales of $1 billion, lost its 20-year patent, and now generic competition can come in. So we've never had a period in history before where so many blockbuster drugs all lost their patents at around the same 2 or 3 year horizon. So we've had all this opportunity for new generics to enter the market. But more important than that, that's been coupled with government price reform on those generic drugs. I used to work in the pharmaceutical industry. In fact, I worked in the generic drug industry. And when I was a sales rep, when we launched a new generic drug, if the brand name cost $100, our price was about $65. The new legislation says if the brand name drug is $100, your price has to be $18 or up to $25. That's the general typical range that the legislated pricing are now at. So we've had a massive drop in the price of generic drugs, coupled with a massive increase in the volume of those drugs. And that's why we've had a negative trend. All of the provinces have now done provincial drug price reform. Ontario started it, we led the charge, but pretty much all of the provinces have come together. And so this just shows you what the legislated price is for generic drugs in the different provinces. We also have a number of drugs that are in the Pan-Canadian Pricing Alliance. That means one price across Canada, and that price is 18% of brands. So there's only 6 drugs in that right now. Or pardon me, I just read this week that there's another 4 that have been added, so it's 10 now. So we'll see more and more, and these would be the top drugs. So Lipitor is one of those generics that is down to 18% of brand right across the country. So great news for your plan, 60-some% of claims filled with a generic drug that's now only 18% of their brand. Fabulous. That's why you've had a low trend. Is it going to continue? That is the question. I think we've kind of bottomed out on the lowering of the price of generics. I mean, we can see, just as an example, the blue line in New Brunswick, within a year and a half, the average price of a generic dropped from $38 down to $21. You know, so I think we've kind of bottomed out. We probably can't be going much lower than 18%. Some would suggest we can, but realistically, I don't think it's likely to happen. So we've had this massive decrease, and that's great news. Unfortunately, though, we're not seeing a lot of plans take advantage of these opportunities. And what that means is introduced mandatory, or what we call at Great-West Life, enhanced generic substitution. Have your plan be designed to say, if there's a generic drug, we will only pay for the generic unless there's a medical reason. Now, traditionally, what we've allowed is the doctor to write no substitution on the prescription, and that means there's a medical reason. But that actually is no longer really a reliable way to assess whether there's a medical reason. And again, coming from the pharmaceutical industry, I can tell you I tried to get my doctors to write no substitution all the time, right? And it had nothing to do with whether the patient had an allergy. It had to do with my sales and my relationship with the doctor. So we recognize now in this marketplace that we have to ask more questions than just allowing no substitution. So there's a form that can be filled out. It's called a brand request form, and it says, yeah, if there's a medical reason, absolutely we'll pay for the brand. But if there isn't, we're only going to restrict coverage to the generic. 62% of claimants don't have a plan that forces them to provide a medical reason if they want to take a more expensive drug. So we would encourage all plans to do that, to say, yes, we will cover your brand name drug if you need it, and you provide, it's a simple form for your doctor to fill out, because some people do have an allergy or a reason to need a particular brand. It's incredibly rare, but it does happen. We have 4 out of 1,000 people fill out that form at Great-West Life. 4 out of 1,000. If you reverse that, it means 99.6% of people can safely and effectively take a generic drug. And so it makes sense to capitalize on this huge opportunity we have and help keep that trend low for as long as possible, because it's coming back. The future is going to come back. And we've already started to see it. If you looked at biologic drug spending, and when I say what is a biologic drug, when I say that I mean expensive. It's a drug that costs $10,000, $15,000, $50,000, $100,000 a year easily. And in 2008, about 10, 11, 12% of all the money we spent on drugs was for one of those high-cost biologic drugs. By the end of 2013, that had grown to 22%. And your plans will probably see very similar statistics. This data comes from IMS Brogan, and it represents all prescriptions filled in Canada. They buy the data from the pharmacies when they fill a prescription, and they're not looking at who's taking drugs, they're really just looking at what drugs are being used and for how much. And so we know that biologic drug spending is growing very dramatically, outpacing the increases in other categories of drugs. And these are the kind of drugs, not only are they expensive, but they often can really be life-changing for a person. Keep them off of disability, slow the progression of their disease. They're not the kind of drugs you want to not cover, because they can affect other costs and certainly people's quality of life. So the challenge is, how do we keep the drug plan sustainable so we can afford this stuff? Because it's only going to grow. And so we'll continue to talk about that. I want to move, though, over to some of the factors that influence your cost increases. And one of the big factors you maybe don't hear a lot about is prescribing guidelines. And these guidelines change all the time. We've just seen some new guidelines. A great example is in cholesterol medication. Now, these are new guidelines published in the United States. They're not in place in Canada, but we very traditionally do follow similar routes as the US with respect to drug safety and coverage and guidelines. So really the key point of it is that this is under the old guidelines, about 37% of people were eligible for a cholesterol drug, and under the new guidelines, it's 48% of people that may be eligible to take a cholesterol drug. So the wider the population, the larger the potential is that your plan will see increases. So as guidelines change, that can increase prescribing, and that can lead to an impact on your drug plan. So this is one of the things you don't really hear a lot about, but it's going on behind the scenes. And guidelines, this is just an example with cholesterol, but guidelines are written for virtually everything, and they're always being modified and updated. And usually often meaning an increase, meaning more people are eligible for those drugs. Rarely is it the reverse where the guidelines say you need to prescribe less. Another thing that's creating upward pressure on your costs, and this is something that our industry is doing a lot of lobbying about. The Canadian Life and Health Insurance Industry Association, CLIA, wrote a report on prescription drug policy earlier this year. I'd encourage you all to read it. And actually it's getting some traction because the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board has just come out last week to say we need to be taking a look at some of the issues that are being created with our legislation. So here's an example of one of them. The drug Remicade, when it was first approved in Canada, was approved for Crohn's disease only. And Crohn's disease was a disease that about 130,000 Canadians have. When you bring a new drug into Canada, you have to apply to the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board, the PMPRB, and you have to justify your price. And essentially the goal of the PMPRB is to make sure we pay a fair price in Canada. And they look at other countries in the world and they say, well, you know, you can't charge any more in Canada than you do these other comparable countries. And part of the argument for giving them a price, and Remicade is around $50,000 a year, is the population. There's only 130,000 people. We need to charge that to recoup our research and development costs. And that's all well and good. But what happens is then over time the drug gets approved for more and more and more diseases. But there's nothing in the legislation to say we have to go back and review the price. So we still have the same price on Remicade, but now there's 1.5 million people that are realistically taking this drug. So that's one of the issues that our industry is lobbying the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board to say we need to revisit pricing once it's been established, once more indications are approved. And so I think we might, in fact, be seeing that change come forward at some point in the future. But that totally means it's going to increase your costs. How many people have Remicade as the number 1, 2, or 3 drug under their plan? Do you know? I would bet virtually everybody does. Almost everybody in this room, Remicade would be the number 1 drug, or 2 or 3 under your plan. It's absolutely in the top 10. Even for a small employer, it's a prevalent condition, rheumatoid arthritis. About 1 in 100 people have rheumatoid arthritis. The other thing that happens is that doctors prescribe the newest, latest, greatest thing all the time, you know, and that is sometimes great. New drugs sometimes do offer better therapeutic value, but sometimes they don't. It's really just another cholesterol pill or another blood pressure pill, and clinically there really isn't an advantage over an older pill. In fact, when you do get your new drug approved in Canada, you really only have to compare it to nothing. How does it work compared to nothing? A placebo. You don't have to compare it to the other pills that are already treating that disease. You have to make sure it works, that it works better than zero, nothing, and that it's safe, it doesn't cause any harm. And once you've proven that, your drug is for sale. So what do we do as the drug rep? We trot off into the doctor's office with all our free samples. Here you go, try this new drug. And you know, the doctors like those free samples because it does 2 things. First of all, it can help people that maybe can't afford medicines, and they can help give them a little bit of extra drugs that way. But also it allows them to give the patient a bit of a trial on that drug. You try it for a couple of weeks, come back and see me. I want to make sure it's working for you, that you're not having side effects and that sort of thing. And so they love those samples and they use them, and what that does to them is it gives them confidence. They start giving those samples out, the people start coming back in and saying, yeah, you know, I feel pretty good, my cholesterol's lower, and the doctor goes, yeah, you know, that's a pretty good drug. And next thing you know, that's the drug he's prescribing for everybody, and he kind of forgets about the older drug that he used to prescribe for high cholesterol because there's nobody talking about it anymore. Plus he's confident, right? This new one works. I've given it to my patients, they're not feeling side effects, and I'm confident as a physician. But that leads to so much higher cost, right? We have a new brand drug A that costs $150 and there is no generic. But if he had prescribed the old brand drug B that cost $100, there would have been a generic at 25% of that cost. So we go from a $25 cost up to a $150 cost when a new drug is introduced. That's a dramatic impact on your plans. And you know, the truth is, how do we impact that? Doctors typically work from the top down. You know, has anybody had their doctor say, do you have a drug plan, just before they write a prescription? We taught them how to do that in the pharmaceutical industry. And really, and that's an important question though, because if people can't afford their drugs, then they may not take them, right? So really what they're asking is, can you afford this, or do you care how much this costs? And that's a good question for a physician to ask. But the problem is, what do all of your employees answer usually? Yeah, I have a drug plan. And what is that telling the doctor? I don't care how much it costs. And so he prescribes the most expensive $150 new drug that doesn't have a generic instead of the older drug that does. And that's where plan design changes the conversation in the doctor's office. I mean, I have clients, and there aren't many, but some that would reimburse some drugs at 50%. When the doctor says, do you have a drug plan? What does that employee say? I do, but be careful, because I might get hit with a big bill at the counter, right? You prescribe a $200 drug, I get to pay $100. So you really can impact the discussion in the doctor's office by having a drug plan design. Promoting generic drugs, making sure your employees know that you have a mandatory generic drug plan or enhanced generic drug plan that will not pay for the higher cost if the doctor writes no sub. So they know to have the right conversation in the doctor's office. Communication is really important. And plan design is going to drive this, because doctors are not going to change this scenario very likely. Yes?
Is there any benefit for the pharmacy, whether or not you get a generic drug or a brand new drug?
That's a good question. It can depend on the drug, and it can depend on the province more particularly. In Ontario, when we did drug price reforms, we eliminated rebates. And so there used to be an incentive for pharmacists to dispense more generics because they got a rebate. In fact, remember when I said the generic was $65 and it got brought down to $25? That difference between 65 and 25 used to go into the pharmacist's pocket as a rebate. Right? And so that's why the government changed our pricing. They said our prices are falsely inflated because the pharmacist is getting extra money from the generic drug company. So those rebates are now gone. So in Ontario, there is not really an incentive for a pharmacist. They don't get that extra money. In other provinces, those rebates are still allowed. So in other provinces, you might have more of an interest for a pharmacist to dispense a generic. There is a markup component on pharmacists' profit, so they just charge a dispensing fee, but they also charge about a 10% markup. So in theory, if you dispense a $100 drug, you get $10. You dispense a $25 drug, you get $2.50. In theory, you would think that means they want to dispense the brand more. But there's also, and so some might, but there's also, big pharmacy chains that sort of have corporate policies. If you go to Costco, if you go to Shoppers Drug Mart, any of the big chains, they have generic policies. They do substitute generic drugs. So that's a long answer to your question. It's going to vary a little bit. Some might have an incentive, some won't. Some will just do the right thing, which is really to give a generic where they're available, unless there's a medical reason not to. So let's talk about what might be happening in the future. And I have to be careful because I've given this talk a couple of times and I've scared the heck out of some clients. So I'm going to try and soften my message going forward a little bit, because there's some very concerning things on the horizon. We have a lot of new drugs that are developed every year, and this is in, I don't think I have my year. This is in 2012. 39 manufacturers, 200 new drugs, 14 therapeutic areas, 129 specialty drugs, 98 of which are oral or injectable. That's an important factor, because if it's an oral thing that you swallow or an injection that you can give yourself, it means your plan's going to pay for it. It's not going to be in the hospital. It's not somebody else's budget usually. It's your plan. 75 of those drugs are biologic, and many of them are oral and specialty drugs as well. So the future development is really around the biologic area. That's where there's a lot of potential for advancement in the treatment of disease, but also a lot of potential for profit for the pharmaceutical industry. Now, when we look at what are the categories that new drugs are coming out in, the biggest one is oncology or cancer drug treatment. Second is neurology. Third is infectious diseases, and this slide is before Ebola. I bet you it's all changed even now. The money that's going into infectious diseases, they're saying, is increasing a lot just because of the Ebola scare, and they're recognizing that we do need to invest more in these kinds of rare things that really could come here to haunt us. But also in infectious diseases is hepatitis C. And I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about what hepatitis C is going to mean to your drug plan over the next few years. Before I do that, though, there's some interesting things that kind of go on in the biologic space. We have patents that expire on biologic drugs, and actually you can see Remicade has actually had the patent expire. So, and we have 2 copies of Remicade for sale in Canada now, but they're not generic equivalents. Health Canada, because biologic drugs have DNA in them, it's hard to say that the DNA from one cow, if that's what the drug has, compared to another, is the same, right? That they're absolutely equivalent. It's easy to do that with a traditional pill. It's a chemical. You can look under a microscope at the brand or the generic and remove those extra ingredients, just the medicine. They're an identical chemical. They're equivalent to each other. So the government regulates those drugs to be bioequivalent, and pharmacists can substitute because they're the same. You can't do that with a biologic drug. They're only regulated to be biosimilar. They're similar to the brand, but they're not equivalent. That means that pharmacists cannot substitute. So the only way to get the generic, the biosimilar for Remicade is if your doctor prescribes it. It might as well be another brand name drug then. Because the way you get a doctor to prescribe is you invest a lot in marketing to those doctors, and that is what ultimately results in a higher price. So these equivalent drugs, or similar drugs, pardon me, are going to be about 85% of the price of the brand. They're really not going to be saving massive amounts of money. But of course, now that those are out, even the drug manufacturer Janssen is now willing to negotiate. So we are in fact now working with Janssen to lower the price of Remicade by about 15%, oddly. So it's now around the same price as the similar drugs. But that's really what's happening, right? Competition's coming, and it's not going to be the same as a generic, but still they want to manage that. And so we'll see what's going to happen with the uptake on that biosimilar for Remicade, and whether doctors do in fact prescribe it. But it's not going to offer a lot of financial relief to your plans. The other thing you'll see is Orencia. That's another rheumatoid arthritis drug. That patent is expiring. And one of the other things, I think it's on the next slide, yeah, Orencia and Simponi, both are losing their patents. So what are they doing? They're actually changing their drug a little bit so that it's no longer going to be infusion, it's going to be self-injected. That gives you another patent. And obviously the plan members would prefer, most would prefer to be able to give themselves a needle at home than go to an infusion clinic and sit there for 3 hours while they infuse the drug into you. So it's an advancement for the plan member, but it comes with a new patent, and of course it means there's no generic or similar competition in those categories. But the bottom line, and I'll go back to this slide, is there are a lot of these biologic drugs that are going to be losing patents over the next few years, and it will be very interesting to see what happens in the market. At some point, Great-West Life may be preferring some of these subsequent entry biologics if it makes clinical sense. And I don't mean preferring so much as what we do with Remicade, for example, or an example is a drug like Remicade. If you've never tried a biologic ever before, it's your first time on it. Remicade's about $50,000 a year. There's several other drugs, and the least expensive one is Humira for maybe $25,000 or $30,000 a year. So when you submit your prior auth request into Great-West Life, and I'd argue that it's the same at every insurance company probably, we will call your doctor and or we will not pay for Remicade first line. We want Humira to be tried first. It's that bottom up instead of top down approach. So we manage that for the high cost drugs where we can, where we've got the clinical evidence to support it. I mean, we don't take the liability on of saying, well, it's cheaper, so try it and see if it works. We have to have some clinical evidence that says, the governing bodies have tested these drugs and they've said, Remicade and Humira for most people are going to work the same, and therefore start with Humira. If it's not working, graduate up. And so we follow those protocols around these drugs. We'll see what protocols come out when these patents expire, and perhaps we'll have the opportunity to do that with some of the similar molecules. So there could be some cost relief, but it's certainly not like the generic thing where it's just automatic. Everybody goes to the generic and we save a lot of money. So this is what I was talking about, subsequent entry, the similar, they're biosimilar, not bioequivalent, and they certainly require very rigorous safety. You know, they have to be proven to be safe again. Unlike a generic drug, once the chemical of Lipitor is proven safe, the generic doesn't have to prove it's safe. We know it's safe. But not with the biologics. We have to ensure that they're different, they're similar, they're not the same, and we have to ensure their safety. So that kind of trial has to continue to go on. Now I want to talk about hepatitis C. Oh my goodness. Hepatitis C is a condition that many of your employees have and they don't know that they have it. It is a virus that harms the liver. It's not like hepatitis A or B. Hepatitis A and B are essentially like a flu in your liver. And you know, you get over it, you can take a vaccine for it, and it's really not a serious condition. Hepatitis C is deadly. It can take many years before it kills you, kills your liver. It can take 20 or 30 or 40 years, but ultimately there's no vaccine, and over time it can be a very deadly disease. It's transmitted through contact with the blood. So traditionally, people who've been ex-injection needle users have been sort of the types of people that would typically get it. There's also some certain ethnicities where it's more common. Maybe people who were getting tattoos in the 70s before there was all the same hygiene around it. Or maybe you're just, your sexual partner was one of those people, right? So there are a lot of people who have hepatitis C who really don't know it. Maybe they did something risky one time in their life many years ago, but they wouldn't consider themselves to be a person at risk. And so, but the reality is that there are estimated to be 250,000 to 300,000 Canadians that have hepatitis C, and they just don't know it. Part of the reason is there aren't a lot of symptoms. It's hard to tell that you have hepatitis C. I mean, I feel like that every day.
Lack of hunger, I'm okay.
Yeah, I suppose.
I should say it comes from blood transfusions.
It comes, oh, you're right, it comes from blood, anything to do with blood, yep. So if you donate blood, you're probably being tested for, in fact, you are being tested for hepatitis C. But that's the other interesting thing is very few Canadians are being tested. Because if you go to your family doctor for your annual physical, they're never going to test you for hepatitis C unless you say, by the way, I never mentioned that 25 years ago I was very promiscuous and I was using injectable drugs. You know, I was taking heroin or something. Then your doctor would absolutely test you. But if you don't say that, they wouldn't have until now, because guess what? The guidelines are changing. The guidelines are going to say that every baby boomer should be tested. Every baby boomer. Guess who has Hep C? All of the baby boomers. It's all of the working people in your population that have this condition, many of which who don't know it. And again, it's more common in an immigrant population, but it's still very, very prevalent for working people. Now, how many people get treated each year? Right now, about 8,000. Very small number of people being treated, and it's largely because of those guidelines. Hardly anybody's being tested to see if they have the condition. But we've now got changes coming to the screening. And what they're basically saying is screen everybody who's a baby boomer. And that's coming from the Canadian Liver Foundation. So about 80% of all cases will be people that are in the baby boomer population. So what is the consequence of this? Wow, a whole lot of people under your drug plans are now going to be screened and found that they have the condition. So what does that mean? Oh, sorry, before we get into the cost of the drugs, what does it mean not to treat them? What if you said, and actually, when I said I've scared some clients on this talk, I've scared some so much that they're saying we're not paying for these drugs. Take them off the plan. Whoa, that's frightening. That's frightening to me because there's issues with not covering. Workplace productivity is one. Death is another for that plan member. And you know what my response to the client, I said, we're going to take these off. We're not covering these drugs. I said, how would you like the front page of the newspaper to say, client A pays 20% of their costs for heartburn and allergies and won't pay for life-saving drugs? It doesn't make sense to not pay for these. If you really want to manage your drug plan, We got to get at the cholesterol pills that people don't really need and the heartburn pills that aren't really life-threatening. We got to manage those costs so we can afford these costs. These are life-saving drugs. And taking them off the plan, in my mind, is really not an option. We got to just find other ways to manage the cost. One of the other things, when you are on the drugs for hepatitis C, and I'll go to the next slide, there's a different drugs now. The newest one is this Sovaldi at about up to $127,000 for your course of treatment. The good news is it's one-time treatment. It's not like Remicade that's $50,000 every year. You will take this once, it'll last about 4 months, and it will either cure you or it will not. It's a cure or not. They're saying the newer drugs have a much higher cure rate, as possibly 90% or higher. The older drugs that we've had for many years still work and are effective, but they're considered to be about 60% cure rate on those. So everybody's going to want the newer one because it's got a much higher potential success rate. But it comes at a very, very high cost. And the other thing is, chances are you will be on disability during those 4 months of your treatment. The drug side effects are it's like having chemotherapy. You're very ill. The drugs make you incredibly sick. You probably can't get out of bed and go to work. And most of the nurses, when you start going into this, just say, go on disability right now. Don't even try and get into work and trying to manage it. You're going to be really, really sick for about 4 months while you're on this drug or on these drugs. So hepatitis C is a major focus of the pharmaceutical industry, and increased screening for hepatitis C baby boomers is going to create a large surge of plan members. And think about it, 1 out of 100 people has hepatitis C and may now get diagnosed. So how big is your population? For every 100 people, you can maybe expect that you'll get 1 person requesting this drug. We now at Great-West Life, this drug, by the way, Sovaldi's been on the market for about 12 weeks. We're at $1 million a day right now. $1 million a day. Think of it this way, if every person who has hepatitis C, which is about 250,000 people, took this drug today, that would cost $25 billion. We spent $22 billion on all drugs last year. This one drug has the power to double our drug spending overnight. Now, it's not going to happen overnight, but it's certainly going to happen over the next few years. That's an additional $25 billion over the next 5 or 10 years that your drug plans are going to have to absorb. That's just the reality of the situation. So is the trend going to stay flat? I don't think so. I think hepatitis C is just the tip of the iceberg. I think there are a lot of other drugs like that that are in development. We've had the patent cliff, and it's reducing the opportunity to lower costs with generic drugs and bringing trends back in line with historical norms. We've got more new drugs coming out, subsequent entry biologics coming out, but not necessarily able to offer you great savings. Hepatitis C will dominate, and I don't know if I'm here next year, there might be another different disease that is going to be dominating again. So drug plan sustainability is an issue, and my final words to you are, don't be complacent if you've got a low trend. I think your trend's going to be going up, and it would be great for you to start looking at your drug plan now, working with your advisor and making sure you've got the right plan design, because you don't want to be in a situation in 2 or 3 years where your trend is now 20% increase for 2 years in a row, and finance has come to you and said, there is no more money. We have a large entitlement population with people, they expect what their doctor prescribes is going to be covered, and I think we have to change that entitlement. Start little steps, get generic substitution in there, make them fill out a form if they have a medical need, and have them understand that we have to manage costs, and start to take away that entitlement mentality, because we're going to have to manage costs much more aggressively in the future, and we should set the stage now. So with that, I want to thank you very much for your time, and certainly I'd be happy to answer any questions.
The new hepatitis C drugs, are those biologics?
Yes.
They are. So
But they're the new Sovaldi is that you swallow it. I don't know if they're biologic, they're specialty.
I'm just curious about when they do eventually come off patent. Is it going to be the same situation as Remicade, or will it be?
It will be the same situation as Remicade.
Okay.
I believe we won't have a equivalent. Unless, by that time though, the laws may have changed around interchangeability and substitution in that, so possibly.
How long is the drug patent?
A drug patent is 20 years, But the reality is, you patent a drug, just as an example, while you're still in the rainforest, right? You find this tree that is a miracle thing, and so you patent that right away. But it might be 10 years before you're selling that pill. So the real time on the market is usually around 10 years. But don't worry about, oh, it's only 10 years. It's a very profitable industry, and in those 10 years, they typically are one of the most profitable industries in the world. So 10 years is enough, and then it's fair for a generic to come out and save us some money. Yes?
Don't the people that have brand name drug come out with a generic themselves?
Absolutely, that's a fantastic point. Most of the brand name drug companies have their own generic version. They don't call it, brand. You wouldn't know unless you asked your pharmacist, but you can. For people that have that, I'm allergic to some ingredient in the generic, really they should just go to their pharmacist and say, which is the generic made by the brand? Because then I'll just take that one and I know I won't have any allergies to it. So yes, most brand companies do have a generic version. In fact, pharmacies now have their own house brand, right? Shoppers Drug Mart has they don't call it a life brand prescription drugs, but they do now. Jean Coutu in Quebec and through McKesson, a lot of the independent pharmacies, they have their own house brands of many of these generics as well. Could be made by the brand. Just like Kraft or Heinz ketchup might make a no-name label, that goes on in the pharmaceutical industry as well. Yes?
When did you say they're going to start the mandatory screening for hepatitis C?
The recommendations are at the public agencies right now. So the Canadian Liver Foundation has gone to the public health agencies and they're under review. I don't know why they would say no to that. I suspect that they will change those guidelines, and it will be soon.
And so you said Canadian Blood Services, they check if you're a blood donor, and would they tell you if you have it, or would they not tell you and just not decline your blood?
I don't know.
I'm just curious.
That's a good question. I would think they have to tell you.
They do tell you?
I would think because your family's at risk,
Okay.
Yeah.
They'll let you know, and then they'll ask you to talk to your doctor about it.
Yeah. Any other questions? Oh,
What will be the employer's ability to not have this drug covered by their plan? Because the cost of the drug is prohibitive for an individual. Many of our people don't even make that in a year
sure.
net. So the first part of our presentation today was for very low-tech needs, we have to entitle people to certain accommodations to work. And now we have a very high-tech thing coming that people can't afford. As employers, are we running the risk that the government mandate that we provide these in our plans, the coverage for this in our plan? Because, if not, and employers say, you know what, our plan just can't handle this. Now we've got the drug out here, we've got people out here who can't pay for it. Now what happens?
That's a great question. Certainly in Quebec and in New Brunswick, the government's changed their laws there that say you have to follow the government formulary. If you offer a drug plan to your employees, you must cover everything that's on those government plans. So potentially, will other governments follow suit? Maybe. I'm not sure that we would get to that point. Again, that's a pretty aggressive thing, is to force an employer to pay for drugs. I think, it might be more incumbent on our industry. To be honest with you, I just this week or last week had my first client say, I don't want to pay for these. And so we're now at Great West Life reviewing of whether we would even do that. Really what you're almost doing is saying, you're going to have to die because I'm not going to pay for your drug. And yet we're paying for heartburn and cholesterol and all this stuff that not life-threatening. I think if your drug plan is really in trouble and you really don't think you can afford it, $500 deductible. Then we can afford all of the expensive stuff, right? And we're not paying so much for all the less. I think that's more the approach, rather than to say we get rid of all the expensive drugs. We put in a huge deductible so the cheap drugs come out of your pocket, and the insurance does what it's intended to do, be insurance, unknown catastrophic risk. Yes?
Just to partially answer what Ross has just asked the question on, because I think it's very good. This is really my role, and Trudy and Jen,
Yes.
is to look at what can we do in a drug plan in order to protect the integrity of the plan. So we do a couple of things. One of the things we do is that is what's called a stop loss. And stop losses come in at 10,000 and above. 10,000 is pretty well the lowest that we see, very rarely a $7,500 one. And what does that mean? It means that any person that has a claim for drugs or health-related issues on the plan, the employer is not responsible for any cost over the stop loss. So if the drug is $70,000, then the employer won't get hit on the premium for anything above $10,000. So that's the type of thing that we do. The larger the group, the bigger the stop loss, because they can handle it. The truism, though, is that Great-West Life, as is every carrier, increasing the cost of their stop loss because of things like this. But it's not enough that you're going to feel that terrible pinch. A stop loss premium is actually very, very good price and good protection against that. And I'll say that yesterday, Trudy, was it yesterday, the day before?
Yes, it
we just had our
yesterday.
first Sovaldi claim. And we had found out about Sovaldi about 6 weeks ago through Barb, because it had only been approved 12 weeks ago. Anyways, this person had to be right front and center, because 12 weeks ago was when this thing happened, and we don't get our drug claim results until a month later, right, Trudy? I know that we've just gotten them that day. I was driving to Toronto, having a great time, taking time off of work to go and see Book of Mormon, and I get this email from Trudy and goes, oh my goodness, this claimant, or this company, had not any issues with their claims all the way along, and she was saying, we got a problem. And in 2 months, it was $65,000.
Yes, I think they're almost like 3 months now.
3 months?
67.
$67,000 on this drug plan. But the issue is, they've got a stop loss. Their stop loss is at $10,000. So they won't get hit for anything above that, and it's a one-time thing. So the employer is not in a really bad situation. The other thing that will happen is that we may suggest to you, what about a deductible? What about putting on 50% reimbursement for chronic issues? That's your antibiotics and so on. 70% for your maintenance, that's your blood pressure, and 100% for your specialty. Because if we do that, then your employees are very well protected against the catastrophic. And so what if they have to pay 50% of a $30 drug? At least they can do that. And there's all sorts of things that we have at our disposal that we can do. And one of the reasons we like Great-West Life, and for people in the room know that we deal with every carrier, they're very progressive. They're very progressive. First of all, they have someone like you, Barbara, who's unbelievable. And she likes this topic, you can tell.
Yes.
And it does scare the bejesus out of us, Barbara, really. But the thing is that they put in a couple of things. Like, first of all, just with a drug card, they've got TELUS pricing. So as soon as somebody uses a drug card, then TELUS pricing comes into effect. It's automatic, the computer does everything. And if a pharmacy charges $90 for a drug that the TELUS price is $80, well, the pharmacist is only going to get $80. That's the bottom line. And the thing is that if they're paper and you don't have a drug claim, there is absolutely no provision to be watching for that. And so we like those drug cards because we can watch what the prices are and we know that we can cover them. Trudy and I and Jen, we look at those drug reports all the time. And we don't know drugs like Barb does, but I'm telling you, we know the good ones. And we're watching for that all the time. And using enhanced generic substitution, saying to people, really, we'd like to put in a drug plan, but we really want it to be, no substitution unless there's a medical reason to have substitution. And you would not believe the pushback we get from a number of employers that say it's not the same, it's a big headache to my employees, blah, 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 and we have to kind of go along with that. But I'll tell you, we are not getting pushback on enhanced generic substitution. We are not getting it. Believe me, if we were, I'd be questioning it because it's my phone call, right? It's the employer, the employees are phoning me, and I don't like those phone calls. I don't like them. So I think that there is a lot of value in that. It does concern me with, removing drugs, but if we have to, we have to. But it does concern me to have to do that because we do want to cover the people that work for us. So sorry for taking so much
No,
time,
that's
Barb, but
fabulous.
I just wanted to tell you that's part of my job, and that's why I depend on so much of Barb and the paperwork she does. So, Lawrence?
Thanks, Terry. I think as well, when being in that business, basically, I get the request from a number of advisors about putting different kinds of caps on drug plans as well. And for example, Terry was very eloquent in saying that because of the pooling protection, there's no need to go to, say, a $10,000 drug cap, because after that you have the pooling protection to protect the employer for those high-cost drugs. So I just wanted to add to that, that there are some advisors that we work with, unfortunately, that do in fact still look at the drug cap maximum as a way to try and eliminate some of those costs.
Maybe you should describe what a drug cap is?
Well, for example, a drug cap is if you have a $10,000 stop loss pooling protection, what they may do is say, we'll go to a $5,000 drug cap or a maximum on the drugs, or $10,000, and then the balance is up to the employee, and they'll try and then convince the employer to use Trillium as an example to try and get those particular drugs paid for that way. But as Barb has talked about, it's very difficult.
Yeah, the governments aren't going to be picking up this cost, not easily, and certainly not if you have an employer plan. It's very difficult to get any provincial coverage for, at least in Ontario, for these drugs. Trillium is a program really designed for the non-working population, the very low-income population, and it's challenging to navigate through. So capping, saying we only pay $10,000 and that's it, anything else go to the government, is not a real solution, certainly not in this province where we don't have the government coverage.
Could you explain pooling?
Yes. So pooling is a dollar, well, maybe, Terry, do you want to describe
Well, it's
it?
all part of the stop loss. So what happens is that we put in drug plans where we just say that no one person that has a drug over $10,000 will affect the premiums, like everything over $10,000. Well, we call that pooling. So what we're doing is pooling the risk over $10,000. Means you're not responsible as an employer. It's the responsibility of the insurance carrier. There's a risk charge for that, but it's the risk charge of the whole block of business.
Perfect.
Any other questions?
What that means is the increase, the price is paid for somebody. Somebody pays it. The government's not going to pay it.
Right.
The company's not going to pay it.
No, the company pays it. If we have stop loss, that employee's fully.
My company's not going to pay it.
Right. Our pool pays for it,
Yeah, the pool pays.
and pool costs are going
The
up.
company's pool paid for it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
Those costs will go up.
those costs will go up.
Right.
But
Through
they're
the roof
total.
if the drug is going to cost as much as all the drugs
I
we've
know.
been issuing per year. So who's going to pay for it? The employer's going to pay for it, who then goes to get the stop loss coverage. I mean,
But the
somebody's
stop
going
loss
to pay
will go
for
up.
it.
Yeah, stop loss does
Individual's not
go
going to
up.
pay for it, the drug company's not going to pay for it, the insurance company's not going to pay for it, the employer's going to wind up paying for it.
These types of things can be very scary moving forward. And if anybody had told us 10 years ago that there would be the generic issue that we've got right now, I think, we'd say, what? You gotta be kidding me, Things do happen, things will change, I'm gonna hang my hat on that. I don't think it's a catastrophic situation at the moment because employers can't afford this, right?
Same like Remicade. If I did this talk 10 years ago and said, what's going to happen to Remicade's going to be the number, everybody would have been concerned about, could we afford it? And yeah, we can. We find ways, we redesign our plans, and we find ways to cover these things.
Well, one of the things that they do with regards to Remicade, I know that, again, because Great West Life is here, I'll talk about Great West Life's programs. They have a health case management system, and I forget how many drugs you've got on that health case management, but how many? 13. As soon as somebody is prescribed one of those drugs, that person, that employee, without your knowledge, is immediately phoned by Great West Life. A nurse phones them, and that nurse starts working with that employee and their doctor to make sure that the step therapy has been done, that they started at the bottom, as you said, as far as costing goes, not as far as drug quality, but costing, and then steps it up, make sure that there's adherence to the plan. Actually, it's a humongous resource to the employee. And we've had experiences with that. We certainly hear, because we allow employees to call us. It helps us because we know what the real experience is. And also, too, we need to know what's wrong with the plan so that when we go into to see an employer, we can say, look, we're seeing a lot of complaints about this and that. However, what I will say about the health case management is that this employee will now have a confidant in that nurse that comes from Great West to know that okay, I'm not feeling that well. Is this thing not working? You know, they can call the nurse. They know that they're taking the right drug. The doctor's looking after them, and so on. It really is a very positive experience. I have yet to see anybody call it an intrusive and negative experience. And these are the things that are being done, and they will help protect plants.
Yes.
They will help. The government is going to be the first one, Ross, to act on this issue, on drug pricing, because they have a bigger problem than you and I. They have a bigger problem than you and I.
And there is talk about national pharmacare. Perhaps we'll see a government role in all of this, taking this on. I don't know. Well, we've had a lot of discussions around national pharmacare. It hasn't happened yet, but it's in the media now. Maybe in light of this drug and this disease and new drugs, perhaps we'll have some national plan. But
well, the cost of the disability on this Hep C is so difficult. And you know, Hep C was something that my father got through a blood transfusion. It was very interesting because they didn't catch it for 15 years.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, I found him on the floor one day, and he went up to University Hospital, and they said it's Hep C. Never knew what the heck it was. He lived with us. He had a number of disabilities due to an aneurysm at a young age, but he had hepatitis C. And by the time, the reason he had collapsed is he was full-blown cirrhosis. And I never knew what encephalopathy was. I sure know what it is now because it's what happens with hepatitis C, and it ultimately was the cause of his demise, right? But he was a real drain on the healthcare system. He was a real drain on the healthcare system because encephalopathy is a major issue. It causes major behavioral problems. You're hospitalized, you're formed, you're everything.
you need a transplant, you're on lists. Yeah.
Transplant, you're on all of these kinds of things. So a one-time cure at $100,000 or $70,000 is almost hallelujah.
Absolutely.
It is hallelujah. So, imagine the savings to the cost of the healthcare system if he was able to be cured of Hep C, which he wasn't.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point.
I get it because we do the hospital. I get the emerge talks every once in a while. I mean, this is a really great thing, you know. It's not a great disease to have.
No.
Any other questions on that? Thank you so much, Barb.
Thank you very much.
And now that we're sufficiently scared, let me tell you, that's my job, okay? I'll make sure that we have at least as many programs in place to help you move forward. And there is some great things that the insurance carriers are doing because they have to, because of the questions from the employers. They're going, get real, insurance carrier. You start doing some stuff to help us along. Meanwhile, the insurance carriers are going, look, we don't want any losses to our pool. So I just wanted to tell you a couple of things. I just wanted to have a couple of words with you with regards to misintrusive group benefits. And I think the last couple of conversations will have emphasized how important what drug plan maintenance and overviews are. But here's what happens to us here at Zavitz Insurance. We are called continually by carriers, Great West Life included, lots of carriers, about the new and improved things that are going on within the industry and within their company. And we see as many of them as we can. And some of them are just like, awesome, oh my gosh, this is super, this is what we should be doing. And some of them, do you want me to, sorry, I'm not yet loud enough, am I? Oh, the video, yeah. Some of them are awesome ideas. Some of them are ridiculous. And the problem that I find is you get them because somebody wants your company as their client, and they may come along and they'll say, oh, you've got to deal with us, look at what we can do. Now just know, if they can do it, so can we. This is not a secret organization. The same companies are coming through this door as they're coming through any other door. Nobody else, you know, everybody looks at different things. But what it is that we do is I will not show you garbage if it doesn't match the test of time. So here's one example. I took all the company names out, but we get called, and of course we got a checklist of every awesome thing that this new plan will do. And the idea behind it is that drug prices are going up all the time, so what we will do is we will cap our administration fees. And the idea is that as drug prices go up, administration fees go up, right? Because administration fees are, as they say, a percentage of the premium. So if the premium's $100 and the premium goes up to $120, then the administration gets an inflation of an automatic 20%. That's what they say, right? So anyways, they said, okay, what we'll do is we'll always keep the administration cost at the, let's say, the $10 rather than having it go up to $12. And we guarantee that for 3 years. And we're going, interesting, let's see what this is all about. Well, then we get something like this. And this is actually what they did give us. And so they've taken a makeshift company and they've said, you know, here's the current volumes, the current rates, and so on. And look at what we can do. It is a 15% reduction in cost, new and improved. Go out to all your clients and change them to this. And I go, okay. Where's the stop loss? Where's the stop loss? Where's the out of country? What drug formularies do you have? What healthcare management do you have? What kind of programs do you have in order to protect that the people don't pay too much if the premiums go down? We get a lot of premiums that go down. They don't all go up. So that means that you're inflating the cost of the administration if the premiums go down. What kind of things do you have there? And by the way, what's the commission? And they told me 10% on this group. Well, we would never charge 10% on a group like this, right? So everything was ridiculous. And this is the part that I want to say to you. If it's ridiculous, we won't show it. If it makes sense, we will show it. And it was interesting, too, because we ran into another case recently where we had a very high utilization and there was going to be a very large increase in the cost of the drugs. And it was legitimate. And it was unfortunate. So what happens is that we had to go out to market, which is just fine with us. We go out to market. A number of carriers wouldn't quote because they felt that the existing premiums were correct. But then another carrier came in and they quoted. Now I want to tell you that the loss ratio was over 100% on this group. So it means that for every dollar that went in premium, over $1 was paid out in claims. One carrier came in, obviously wanted the business, was on the market to be sold or whatever, at a lower cost than the current rate. Now how is that feasible? Now I had to show it and I'm saying, okay, if you want to go there, we can go there. But you're going to get hit really bad in the next year. So these are the types of things that we'll do to be reasonable. I mean, if you want to reduce your rates for a year, I can do that, and that's exactly what we'll do. So these are the kinds of things that we see. If they make sense, we're going to go through it. So if you're approached by, we can save you money and all that sort of thing by doing all sorts of things that nobody else can do, it's usually not exactly correct. I like the one we don't charge commission. No, we're all in the charity business. There's some other fee somewhere in there, and we're seeing everything. And then we can help you control bad claims. It's impossible. I mean, we can look at the drug utilization every single month. We do that all the time, but really where it has to happen is the insurance companies have to have the price controls in place right at the very beginning. They have to have the computer services to be able to manage all of these claims, and they have to have people like Barb who work with the insurance carriers, and they say, okay, this is a problem, this is how we price it, this is how we're going to have to do this. So just know that you're very important as the employer in regards to getting the right plan in place, to covering the employees in the way that fits the philosophy of your firm and your budgets and so on. The insurance company's responsibility is to offer plans that help control costs as best as possible, but provide very good benefits for the employees, and our job is to make sure that things make sense. It all works in together, and what things can we put into place that will help the employees as best as possible as the employer can do that. So it's a three-way street in everything that we do, and you know, you're not doing your job unless you're always making sure that the employer is paying the lowest cost possible that's reasonable in this situation. So I think that was my last slide. Is there any final questions that we've got today that I can help you out with? Okay, thank you very, very much. Good seeing you, and thank you for coming out. Have a great day.